Really quick, my name is Erin McCuskey. I'm from the Northwest Colorado Small Business Development Center. Many of you signed up through the SBDC, so hopefully you're already familiar with our services. Just a reminder that we provide free one-on-one business consulting services to all small business owners in Colorado. The SBA defines small business owners as anyone with 500 employees or less. And so pretty much all of us in rural Colorado qualify for that free consulting support. I'm very excited today to be joined by Bob McNutt, who is a consultant with the SBDC, and he'll tell us a little bit more about his background. But he's already been helping quite a few business owners in particular with their transactions, whether it be buying or selling a business. Bob consults with 3 of our SBDCs, with the Northwest SBDC, with the West Central SBDC, which is based in Montrose, and also with the Central Mountain SBDC based in Salida. So we kind of call ourselves the Rocky Mountain rock stars, and Bob can help any of the business owners within our region out, which is a tremendous resource for all of us here. So you can learn more about us at coloradosbdc.org. You can learn more about my center specifically at northwestsbdc.org. Sign up for consulting with any one of us, but please reach out if you have any questions. And with that, Bob, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you to kick things off.
Okay. Can everybody hear me okay?
We can.
Perfect. I do want to encourage everyone to go ahead and turn their cameras on. I want to try to make this as interactive as possible. And I also want to tell you, you can see right now I'm looking off to my right, and I'm actually looking at the monitor that I have all of your cameras on. With the way my monitor's set up, I have to look left and right pretty much to see the presentation and the people. Let's make this really interactive, because I can almost guarantee you if you have a question, somebody else does too. So interrupt anytime, unmute yourself if you have a question. You can also throw it in the chat box, and either Lauren or Erin will make me aware that there's a question. Please don't hold your questions till the end. As we go through this, let's get them answered, because based on your questions, there may be other information that we really need to dive into a little deeper, and that's hard to do if we wait till the end. As Erin said, my name's Bob McNutt. I lived and have been in the Glenwood Springs area, and actually lived in Glenwood for almost 35 years now. Moved out here with my family right after college. My wife and I owned an IT company in Glenwood Springs for 26 years that we sold 2 years ago in September. During that 26-year endeavor, we bought and sold small businesses, mostly in the later years. So we got some experience at the small business level, not dealing with corporate buyers. And I think my next slide, I'll give you a book to help with that, because I've never been through it personally, but I have a lot of other owners of businesses that have. And it's a very different process when you're being bought by a corporation as opposed to being bought by another small business owner. So essentially, 26 years ago, I made myself a job and wasn't very good at paying myself in the beginning. So I actually started my business by paying our mortgage on our credit card for a whole year. Not a smart thing to do, and would encourage no one to do that, but that's how I got started 26 years ago. And there was 2 things that transformed our business and made it very valuable when we sold it. One is a peer group. We had belonged to an industry-specific peer group for the last 6 years of our business, and it totally changed how we did our business. And it also took it from something that didn't have a lot of value to something that had value to sell. And then the second thing was EOS. So if you have an EOS, stands for Entrepreneurial Operating System. It's part of the consulting I do now. If you can't find an industry-specific peer group, then go to a non-industry specific peer group like Vestige, or there's a couple others in Denver. There's a lot of them around, but those things will really make your business more valuable over the long run. So this is the book I was talking about called Acquired. This is specifically how to sell, or the challenges of selling a small business to a larger company. And I love his, merged into a large multinational firm, barely survived the transition. They have a whole team of lawyers typically in those transitions, and you've got your local lawyer trying to keep up with everything, and a whole bunch of other things. So if you jot this book down in case you get into that situation, because what I'm going to be talking about is really small business to small business. Okay. So 75% of sellers were disappointed by the transaction. Why do you think that is? Somebody will be brave here if I'm quiet long enough and unmute.
I took longer than I liked.
Took longer than I like, okay. That's definitely one of them, because it takes a long time. You'd be amazed at, and I'll cover it a little bit longer, but it does take a long time from a little bit of interest to actually getting the darn thing closed.
And I'm
I
sure
didn't think they got enough for their business.
Yeah, another good reason. What else? If a seller is disappointed in the transaction, do you think it affects the buyer? It does. I'll answer that one. It definitely affects the buyer and his success. So anything we can do to kind of close the gap on both of those. You're always going to have seller's remorse, and you're actually always going to have buyer's remorse too. But we want to try to do a lot of things right to limit the number of days that happens, or weeks or months, depends on the transaction. So here's some of the reasons that you want to prepare to sell your business, right? And I tell people, even if you're brand new in business, prepare to sell your business. Because the preparation to get your business ready to sell only makes you more profitable and makes your business run better. So, 5, 10, 15 years before you actually sell, if you'll go through and do a lot of this stuff, it just allows you to spend less time in the business, or build it better, or get better profits out of it. It also makes you start focusing on profit and gross margins, which is tremendously important to what you put in your bank, and then also makes it easier to work with banks when you need to go and get a loan or expand or do whatever. And then take a look at that last one, creates leaders in your business. So unlike some people that talk about how to buy and sell your business, I've got actually 2 slides and a short video that we'll get to here in a few minutes, because really creating the leaders in your business helps you tremendously, and it also adds a ton of value when you go to sell. You've got that first level, which is how much are you involved in the business, and the less you're involved in the business on the day-to-day operations when you go to sell makes it more valuable. But then if you take that next step to where you're not involved that much, but you have a team of leaders, then your value really starts going up. So some of the reasons you'd like to buy a business. Some of us entrepreneurs just buy them because we find it challenging, right? I know the first couple I bought, the challenge was we were already way too busy, but when the opportunity came up, it's like, yeah, let's try this. It allows you to acquire customers in a saturated market, acquire good employees, which up here in the mountains can be a really good reason to buy, because we have such a hard time attracting employees that can actually live in the valley or on the Western Slope. And so if you're buying an existing business, they already know, they already have homes and know how expensive it is. Just as a side note, we always used to, if anybody came from outside of the Western Slope to interview for us, part of their interview process was they had to go talk to a realtor and find out how much apartments and houses and how much a gallon of milk costs, because a lot of times if you're posting an ad and people are coming from far away, they think the salaries are real good and they don't really have a perspective on what the cost is to live up here. And then of course, the last one's cash flow. You know, you've got immediate cash flow as compared to trying to build a business that you're starting. All of us are going to sell our business, right? Either we're going to sell it because we decide to sell it, or, you know, if you pass away, then someone's got to sell the business for you. So it may be time for you to retire, you may pass away, or, you know, or your significant other may pass away and your focus goes elsewhere. You can really reach a plateau. And, you know, those plateaus, when you go from 1 to 2, when it's just yourself and you go to an employee, the whole business has to change. And then about the time you get to 10, the whole business has to change again. And it's, when I mean the whole business, it's how you run it, your processes, those types of things. And so once you get to 10, then it's more of a numbers, a gross margin game. But, you know, by the time you hit 5,000 to 10,000, everything has to change in the company again. And some entrepreneurs just burn out and don't want to go to that next level of leadership training and process and all of that. So we see people doing that. And then like the life-changing events, kids may be off in college now or out of college, and you know, you've been working 60, 80 hours a week like I used to, and maybe you just want to slow down a little bit. So here's something that, that I don't hear a lot of people talk about, which is you should prepare to sell your business at least 5 years in advance. We covered some of it earlier, right? Which is because it's going to make you more profitable and give you better margins and allows you to start investing in your leaders. But it takes that a long time to put processes and standardization and the documentation into your business that buyers want to see, or that you want to have in place, because it's going to give you, get you a lot better multiple, and i.e. More money for your business. Some of the other things you want to make sure of, if you haven't done as you went along, is, you know, make sure you've got non-solicitation agreements with your employees. Because if you don't, it's going to reduce what you can get for your business. And some people buying businesses come in and say, well, I'm going to give you $3 million for your business, but that's contingent on you paying all of your employees to sign a non-solicitation agreement or non-compete. Non-competes are a lot harder to enforce in Colorado. There's really just a niche carved out. But because if I'm going to come in and buy your business, I don't want all the employees taking off and doing business directly with these customers that I'm buying. So if you have contracts, that helps, but really you want to have non-solicitation agreements. And it's much easier to do that over time as opposed to right as you're running up to the sale or getting ready to sell it. It also helps you then start determining how your industry is valued. Could be multiples of EBITDA, could be a cap rate, it could be multiples of revenue. Every industry is a little bit different, but it's important for you to understand how your business is valued, and then you can start doing things to improve that, and then also make sure that your books are being kept in a way that it's easy to show those types of things when you get some buyers interested. Everyone that buys a business is interested in recurring revenue, and the more of that you can put in place, the more valuable your business is. And then invest and build leaders. That is, I mean, I'm going to harp on it a lot, but those leaders are really who they're buying. Your financials have to be in order. There has to be enough money there to make sense for what you're asking. But there's a lot more goodwill that will be included when you have that strong leadership team. The next two slides are going to deal with leadership, and then we'll get back to buying and selling. So Brené Brown, if you haven't read any of Brené Brown's stuff, I would encourage you to. Dare to Lead is her latest book. But she defines leadership as anyone or team who takes the responsibility to find potential in people and processes and has the courage to develop that potential. So some people are people are good with people and they can develop potential in people. Other people are more analytical and engineer slanted, and they can be leaders too, because they can really dive into the process side of things. Most people don't feel like they're a leader probably in your company because, number one, they haven't done this amazing big thing that would make them a leader, or they haven't been given a position that's called a leadership position. So this next slide's a little TED Talk. It's just a few minutes long. And it's really what I think encompasses leadership and what you want to try to bring into your business with your employees. So everyone just bear with us here. And like I said, this is only just a few minutes and it's a really good TED Talk.
How many of you are completely comfortable with calling yourselves a leader? See, I've asked that question all the way across the country, and everywhere I ask it, no matter where, there's always a huge portion of the audience that won't put up their hand. And I've come to realize that we have made leadership into something bigger than us. We made it into something beyond us. We made it about changing the world. And we've taken this title of leader and we treat it as if it's something that one day we're going to deserve. But to give it to ourselves right now means a level of arrogance or cockiness that we're not comfortable with. And I worry sometimes that we spend so much time celebrating amazing things that hardly anybody can do that we've convinced ourselves that those are the only things we're celebrating. And we start to devalue the things that we can do every day. And we start to take moments where we truly are a leader, and we don't let ourselves take credit for it, and we don't let ourselves feel good about it. And I've been lucky enough over the last 10 years to work with some amazing people who have helped me redefine leadership in a way that I think has made me happier. And with my short time today, I just want to share with you the one story that is probably most responsible for that redefinition. I went to a school on a little school called Mount Allison University in Sackville, New Brunswick. And on my last day there, a girl came up to me and she said, "I remember the first time that I met you." And then she told me a story that happened 4 years earlier. She said, on my day before I started university, I was in the hotel room with my mom and my dad, and I was so scared and so convinced that I couldn't do this, that I wasn't ready for university, that I just burst into tears. And my mom and my dad were amazing. They were like, "Look, we know you're scared, but let's just go tomorrow. Let's go to the first day. And if at any point you feel as if you can't do this, that's fine. Just tell us, we will take you home. We love you no matter what." And she says, so I went the next day and I was standing in line getting ready for registration, and I looked around and I just knew I couldn't do it. I knew I wasn't ready. I knew I had to quit. And she says, I made that decision, and as soon as I made it, there was this incredible feeling of peace that came over me. And I turned to my mom and my dad to tell them that we needed to go home. And just at that moment, you came out of the Student Union building wearing the stupidest hat I have ever seen in my life. It was awesome. And you had a big sign promoting Shinorama, which is Students Fighting Cystic Fibrosis, a charity I've worked with for years. And you had a bucket full of lollipops. And you were walking along and you were handing the lollipops out to people in line and talking about Shinorama. And all of a sudden, you got to me and you just stopped and you stared. It was creepy. This girl right here knows exactly what I'm talking about. And then you looked at the guy next to me and you smiled and you reached in your bucket, you pulled out a lollipop and you held it out to him. And you said, you need to give a lollipop to the beautiful woman standing next to you. And she said, I have never seen anyone get more embarrassed faster in my life. He turned beet red and he wouldn't even look at me. He just kind of held the lollipop out like this. And I felt so bad for this dude that I took the lollipop. And as soon as I did, you got this incredibly severe look on your face and you looked at my mom and my dad and you said, look at that, look at that. First day away from home, and already she's taking candy from a stranger. And she said everybody lost it. 20 feet in every direction, everyone started to howl. And I know this is cheesy, and I don't know why I'm telling you this, but in that moment when everyone was laughing, I knew that I shouldn't quit. I knew that I was where I was supposed to be, and I knew that I was home. And I haven't spoken to you once in the 4 years since that day, but I heard that you were leaving. And I had to come up and tell you that you've been an incredibly important person in my life, and I'm gonna miss you. Good luck. And she walks away, and I'm flattened. And she gets about 6 feet away, she turns around and smiles and goes, you should probably know this too. I'm still dating that guy 4 years later. A year and a half after I moved to Toronto, I got an invitation to their wedding. Here's the kicker, I don't remember that. I have no recollection of that moment, and I've searched my memory banks because that is funny, and I should remember doing it, and I don't remember it. And that was such an eye-opening, transformative moment for me to think that maybe the biggest impact I'd ever had on anyone's life, a moment that had a woman walk up to a stranger 4 years later and say, you've been an incredibly important person in my life, was a moment that I didn't even remember. How many of you guys have a lollipop moment, a moment where someone said something or did something that you feel fundamentally made your life better? All right. How many of you have told that person they did it? See, why not? We celebrate birthdays where all you have to do is not die for 365 days. And yet we let people who have made our lives better walk around without knowing it. And every single one of you has been the catalyst for a lollipop moment. You have made someone's life better by something that you said or that you did. And if you think you haven't, think about all the hands that didn't go back up when I asked that question. You're just one of the people who hasn't been told. But it is so scary to think of ourselves as that powerful. It can be frightening to think that we can matter that much to other people. Because as long as we make leadership something bigger than us, as long as we keep leadership something beyond us, as long as we make it about changing the world, we give ourselves an excuse not to expect it every day from ourselves and from each other. Marianne Williamson said, our greatest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our greatest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light and not our darkness that frightens us. And my call to action today is that we need to get over that. We need to get over our fear of how extraordinarily powerful we can be in each other's lives. We need to get over it so we can move beyond it. And our little brothers and our little sisters, and one day our kids, or our kids right now, can watch us start to value the impact we can have on each other's lives more than money and power and titles and influence. We need to redefine leadership as being about lollipop moments. How many of them we create, how many of them we acknowledge, how many of them we pay forward, and how many of them we say thank you for. Because we've made leadership about changing the world, and there is no world. There's only 6 billion understandings of it. And if you change one person's understanding of it, one person's understanding of what they're capable of, one person's understanding of how much people care about them, one person's understanding of how powerful an agent for change they can be in this world, you've changed the whole thing. And if we can understand leadership like that, I think if we can redefine leadership like that, I think we can change everything. And it's a simple idea, but I don't think it's a small one. And I want to thank you all so much for letting me share it with you today.
So I watch this video a lot. I do it in a lot of my presentations. It's just a really cool story. But if you can start working with your employees and help them understand that's what leadership is, it's touching your clients' lives, in a business way that's very positive. That's where you start building a lot of value in your people, and the value in your people is what makes your business worth more, whether you're selling it or not. Okay. So, and help your people understand that, because so many people think they have to be appointed a leader before they are. So about 2 or 3 years out before you're ready to sell your business, I like selling business in kind of a non-traditional way, which is if I can sell it without listing it with a broker, that's the way I would prefer to sell it, because my businesses are small businesses and I have a lot of relationship with my customers. So I'm always more interested in trying to find the right person to continue the service than just the top dollar. Now, having said that, I obviously want a really good price for my business, whatever one I sell, because I have a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in it. Start creating that relationship either with potential buyers or potential sellers. I did that, and you should be doing it through your peer groups, through your industry contacts, those types of things. And then start creating relationships with brokers, right? Because you may not be able to sell it without having a broker. You may not want to sell it without having a broker, but you want to have a good broker if you are doing that. And they can actually help you with that process. 6 years before I sold my business, I got a call from a broker in Denver, just out of the blue. I'm not sure why I even took the call, because I typically didn't take those types of calls, but he said he wanted to list my business, my IT business in Glenwood. And I thought, oh, that's cool. And so my chest popped up and, I puffed out, and I'm like, I spent 45 minutes telling him how great of a business I had. And at the end of that 45 minutes, he says, well, Bob, I'm sorry, but your business isn't worth anything. He said, what you need to do is don't worry about Glenwood Springs, just maintain what you've got, go to the Front Range in Denver, open an office, 1 or 2, and start building clients down there, and you will make a business that is sellable. And the main reason he was saying it wasn't sellable was, number one, it was all time and material at that point. And then number 2, I was still way too involved in the day-to-day and responsible for too much revenue. I got off that call. First thing was I thought he was an idiot. And then I got really angry. And then after I got over being angry and all of that, I started checking around, and guess what? He was right and I was wrong. My business wasn't worth much at that point because I didn't have the leadership. I was too involved in the business. I didn't have reoccurring revenue. So that's when we went out and got involved in a peer group. And the peer groups really hold you accountable for what you're doing in your business and bring a lot of good ideas. So create relationships with brokers, start 2 or 3 years out and figure out if there's an employee that might be a buyer. You know, those are much different transactions, but it's certainly something you shouldn't gloss over because that may offer you tax benefits and a lot of other stuff. Plus, you have a good relationship with your employees. You have a pretty good idea how they will run the company after you step away. The non-negotiables list. This is really important. So when you're preparing to buy or sell a business, you need to create a list, and I call it non-negotiables because that's what my mentor called it when I was in the peer group. It's a list of what's important and what you want to get out of the transaction. And for me, for some people, the dollars are at the top of the list. I want X number of dollars, and that's the most important thing. I had about 12 or 13 things on my non-negotiables list, and the very last thing was the price that I would take for it. It didn't mean price wasn't important. I was no way in hell I was giving away something that I'd spent 26 years on and not get at least a fair price or a premium price for it. But some of the things on my non-negotiables list is example, and these aren't yours. You have to create your own. The first thing was they had to retain all the employees with no changes in their salary for 6 months. They had to leave all customer contracts in place for at least 6 months. They needed to try and invest in the local community. And I didn't want to continue working after I sold the business. I would make a terrible employee in general, and then to have to watch someone run my business and not the way that I used to do it was going to be very difficult. I didn't want any earnouts. In our IT business, it's very normal to get earnout, right? Which is you get 80% or 75% of the purchase price, and then the rest of it comes after 2 years, assuming the revenue doesn't change, doesn't go down, basically. Most earnouts don't give you anything more if it goes up. It's just a subtraction if it goes down. And I had other things, but like I said, at the very bottom of the list was the price. And so anytime someone approached me as a buyer, I had a version of that, less the price and a couple of other things that I would forward to them, right? Because they could take a look at that list and decide if they even wanted to continue the conversation. And I knew if they continued the conversation, they had some idea about, you know, what was important to me. So don't underestimate the value of a non-negotiables list, whether you're buying or selling. If you're on the buy side, it really helps you focus in on what's important in a transaction and weed things out. I'm amazed in the last year how many people have decided to buy a business, but they aren't sure what industry they want to be in. And all I ever wanted to do was pick an industry and buy in that. And I've changed industries of what I buy, but I focus on a industry. And if you aren't focused on an industry, it's even more important to understand what's important to you in a transaction, because it's even a little bit harder to sort those, what comes down the pike as an opportunity. And then we've already talked about it, non-solicitation, non-competes in place. You know, I'm not a lawyer, so work with a lawyer on these documents, but essentially, you know, particularly for a non-compete, you have to provide money to someone to sign a non-compete. And at the hiring process, that's much easier to do. But if you're trying to put non-competes in after the fact, if you don't pay them, they're not worth the paper that's written on. And even if you pay them, depending on the situation, they still may not be worth the paper that they're written on. So non-competes are definitely a big legal issue that you need to know. And then non-solicitations for the most part also, but they're easier to enforce, and I think they're more reasonable. You know, if I always told all my guys in my businesses that if you want to go out and compete against me directly, I would encourage you to do that. The one thing you can't do is take customers with you unless we agree upon it as you exit, because A lot of times employees don't understand how hard it is to get customers, and they think it's just their right to walk out the door with their relationships. And a non-solicitation agreement formalizes that. Plus, you should do a lot of training on it too. As you build leaders in your company, you want to be talking about these difficult subjects with them. Any questions on this first part, on what we covered so far? And Aaron or Lauren, are there any questions in chat yet?
We don't have any questions in the chat, so I encourage people to type those in, or you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question live if you're ready to do so. Bob, would you like me to push that first poll question? I
Yes.
forgot
please do.
to at the beginning.
No problem. So Aaron's gonna, and I forgot to remind you to do it. So Aaron's gonna drop a poll question out there. It'll just help me figure out kind of why you're here and to make sure that we will address the things that are important to you. Please do me a favor. If I go all the way through this and nobody asks any questions, then I feel like an idiot because I think I haven't provided very good value. So help me out with my ego as we go forward here and ask some questions as it happens. And then Aaron, I'm not as experienced with the polls, so I think at some point you have to stop it, and then I'll be able to see the percentages if I remember right.
Yeah, I'll close it in just a second. It looks like a few people are still responding, but Brian, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask that question live?
Yeah, that'd be fine. Brian Gandy, Bob, thank you very much for doing this. This is already very insightful. So my question was, is the non-solicitation just easier to enforce in Colorado and just better in a non-compete in that way? And is it better for service-based businesses, or if you're selling widgets, would a non-compete make more sense?
Certainly in a service-based business, you know, if you're selling widgets, there's already a high level of entry for an employee. You know, they've got to go out and buy inventory and do the retail space and all of that. So yeah, the more service-oriented you are, the more important non-solicitation non-competes are.
Okay.
Because
yeah, and I've just heard more and more that NDAs and non-competes are super hard to enforce in general. So I appreciate you adding that to the stack for an option. Yeah.
My understanding, I'm not a lawyer, but there's like 3 carve-outs that are really easy to enforce on a non-compete. It's doctors, vets, and I never can remember the third. And it has to be within a reasonable mileage. And so that's why non-solicitation agreements are just much better, I think, because just personally from a philosophical standpoint, I don't want to keep somebody that's working for me from competing against me. I just don't want them to take all the customers out the door because that's the hard part, right? And if they want to go compete, I always told my guys that I was okay with that. And I would help them. And having that mindset, actually, I never had anybody really go out with, I think, one exception to try to compete against me because it set the tone and it helped me build leaders. So here's a quick example of non-negotiables. And I think I covered some of the seller side, but you know, from a buyer, you may want the seller to remain in the business for a certain period of time. And as a buyer, you probably want to have some type of an earnout in there. It keeps sellers honest from cooking the books quite as much because part of their income off the sale is going to be reliant on the revenue continuing to come in. We already talked about the buyers wanting a non-solicitation, non-compete. And then those were some of the seller ones that I had on my list. I want to be clear though, just because you have it on your non-negotiables list, that's just a framework to help you know what you want in the transaction. You know, there's nothing that prevented the buyer of my business from raising contract prices. There's nothing in the contract that makes them keep the employees employed at the current rate. The point being is that it set the tone and it helped communicate to the buyer that I eventually sold to what was important to me and helped him figure it out too. It's probably a little further along, but there's a couple of things, and one in particular that really, I think, predicts what kind of problems you're going to have in a transaction and how successful it's going to be. So there's a term called operational maturity level, OML. And what OML is about is your processes and how you do business. And the example I give to kind of clarify that, which is a company that has a high operational maturity in their sales department. If it's a low operational maturity, they just have their salesperson on a salary and they get paid whether they produce or not. The next step up in the operational maturity in a sales department is, they have a base salary and then they get paid commission based on the gross revenue they sell. If you get really high operational maturity in the sales department, your salesman is paid on the gross revenue of what they sell, right? That gives them the ability to price things out and be reactive, or meet customers' needs right in the field. Because if they don't price it right and make sure there's enough money in there for service and stuff like that, their paycheck's going to go down. So that's an idea of operational maturity just within the sales department. Your whole company has operational maturity levels. And don't just assume because the person buying you is a bigger company that they actually have a higher operational maturity, because a lot of times they don't. So if the buyer of your company, or if you're buying a company and you're buying somebody that has a lower operational maturity than you do, it's a much easier transition typically, because you can immediately go in, and as far as for the customers, you can immediately go in and offer a whole bunch of services that weren't currently being offered. It is stressful on the employees though, because they have to do things differently and conform with your processes. If you're buying a company that has higher operational maturity, I think that's where you really got to be careful, because if you're buying them because you want to bring that operational maturity to your company, that's a good reason, but you have to really focus as you make decisions after you bought it, because what a lot of buyers do if they buy a company with a higher operational maturity is they destroy that operational maturity, because they want to put everything into their processes, and their processes just aren't as mature. And the story that I got, so in the peer group, we submitted financials every quarter to a company called Service Leadership Development. And they're specific to the IT industry, but they benchmarked everybody in the peer group. And Brian O'Connor told me a story once. He goes, we've been dealing with this company for many, many years. They're about $275 million in revenue. They have a staff of 8 people in acquisitions. And he said they went out and bought a company that had 75 million in gross revenue. A normal transaction for him, he said 30 days in, they realized that company had a significantly higher operational maturity. And he said, and Brian said, what I've always seen in the past is they just destroy it. And he said, this company had the wisdom. They stopped all processes. All 8 people in the acquisitions department's responsibility was to figure out how to bring that operational maturity from the $75 million company into the $275 million company. And he said it's the only time he's ever seen a company that aware and to react that well. He said most of the time, the bigger company just destroys the smaller company, which means they lose revenue, they lose employees, and they lose customers. So really think about that as you're evaluating a buy, and then think about that as you're evaluating a sell. If your top of your non-negotiables list is the price, then operational maturity may not be that important to you. But if you're selling and you want the same level of customer service and you want your employees treated the same, then OML could be a big issue and could really impact the transaction. Anybody see that DJ in my presentation in blue? That's interesting. I've never seen that there before. Must have gotten carried away as I was reviewing the slides. So
I'm sorry, that was me messing with the annotate function. I'll erase that.
yeah, because it's on the multiple slides.
I didn't know it would show up there. I thought it was something I could use to take notes.
That's interesting. I've never tried that feature, so no problem at all. None at all. I love when people experiment with technology.
Yeah.
So
Be careful.
So Bob, I have a question for you if you got a minute.
definitely.
So you've been talking about fairly large operations. What can you tell us about a smaller operation, sort of a mom and pop that's been around for 40 years? And we have a river outfitting business. And the biggest thing that we have is access to resources that are no longer available to anyone else. So the only way people can get access to those resources is to buy an existing operation out. And again, it's a seasonal business. It's primarily my wife and I and one part-time bookkeeper, and then we hire guides in the summer. It can be anything from this year, because of COVID, I've only had 3 guides, but most years I have 10 or 12.
Okay. So define for me what is big and small for you. Because when you say I'm talking about bigger businesses, I'm like, really? So tell me
Well,
what
I
big
just
and small
told
means
you
to
what I was. I mean, it's mom and pop and part-time bookkeeper, and 2 to maybe 10 guides in the summertime.
So when I sold my company, I had 11 people total in the company. That included my wife and I. And we consider ourselves a mom and pop because, I mean, we had worked in the business from the beginning. I had, and then after our kids were raised, my wife jumped in. So let's see, your question is what to do with the smaller business and how to make that attractive. Well, you already kind of defined yourself that it's not so much the leaders in your business or the service that you're giving. For the most part, it's maybe more about resources. I'm assuming you're talking about like permits on the river and access points and stuff like that.
Yeah, permits on the river and Forest Service permits and things like that. And then kind of tied to a property we've operated out of here for 36 years, which is very sort of, I guess I would say it's a good property. It's right on the highway. It's midway between 2 of the most popular put in and take out points on the river. And, it helps us facilitate other parts of our business, like doing other people's shuttles and doing a big rental business as far as renting out things like tubes and inflatable kayaks and small rafts and things like that.
Okay. So what I'm hearing you, so I sold a service business, right? And the most service businesses are EBITDA based, earnings before taxes, depreciation, amortization, and probably missing one in there. And then and so I didn't even sell my office building, right? I retained my office building, and part of my deal was a 5-year lease. I actually wanted a 3-year lease, but the buyer wanted 5. So I was selling strictly services. It sounds like in your case, you're selling hard assets, which we had very little of. And typically the hard assets in the real estate are going to be based off of cap rate. And then you're going to have that service side also.
Can you tell me what a cap rate is?
Oh, that's the net income coming off of the property or the assets that are hard, divided by the sale price. And that's your cap rate. Like if you're buying office buildings, a good cap rate would be 4 or 5%, meaning whatever the net income each year is, it's 4 or 5% of the overall purchase price. So you probably have a mix, and that's where your CPA could get involved and have a much better understanding or help you understand it. So far, I've either bought and sold service businesses or bought and sold businesses with more hard assets. I don't really have a lot of experience with that combination. Okay. Does that answer your question at all?
It's a start. Thank you.
What else though? Keep talking.
Oh, I'm just kind of curious. I mean, just something that we've been in for a long time, and I know we've built up a lot of equity, particularly in the property that we own. And I guess one question would be, should I try to sell the one business, which is the river business, in conjunction with the property, or try to set them apart? The piece of property I own is probably appreciated about 8-fold since I bought it back in the early 1980s.
Okay. So I'm not giving advice on this, but I will share my experience and say that if it were me, I'd sell the business and hold the property, right? Because part of what a lot of people want to sell their business for is to start getting revenue coming in that doesn't require them to be all the time, whether you're retiring or just doing something else. And so that's a good strategy, and that's a strategy I used. I sold the business, but I held on to the real estate, and probably will for several years. So that'd be my advice, is to split them up, because and then if you do split them up, make sure that part of the deal is there some type of a lease from you on the land for some period of time. Typically, it's 3 to 5 years, right? So you've sold your business and you've got another income flow off the passive side, which should be the real estate. Okay.
So
Thank
Bob,
you.
we have a couple questions in the chat really quick, and then we can open it back up. But can you clarify first what is an earnout?
Oh, okay. So an earnout is, let's say I'm getting paid $1 million for my business. And let's say, these are just random numbers, but let's say we're running each month $100,000 in gross revenue. So what an earnout would say, a buyer would come to me and he said, okay, I'm going to give you $750,000 of that 1 million when we close. And the other $250,000 is going to be dependent on, at the end of 2 years or 1 year or whatever, that gross revenue has either stayed the same or grown. And if it hasn't stayed the same or grown, then you're not going to get any of the $250,000, or you're going to get a percentage of the $250,000. And that's a way for buyers to make sure that the seller stays engaged during the transition process, and make sure all those relationships are handed off. Does that make sense?
Thank you. And then we have a couple questions from Joaquin, who I've asked to unmute and ask live if possible.
Yes, of course. I'll ask them live. Just my question was whether, if you're buying a retail business, say a retail store, or a liquor store, or a convenience store, would it be more important to focus on a non-compete agreement with the seller rather than a non-solicitation agreement with the employees?
Possibly, for sure. Yeah, probably. I mean, if your workforce is lower end as far as the pay scale and the skill set, then yeah, non-solicitations aren't that important. And
Okay.
I'm glad you,
Mhm.
go ahead.
Sorry, as a follow-up to that question regarding the seller financing, I mean, in the case of some of these retail businesses, there's an important component of inventory that you have to purchase with the transaction. Would it be more or easier for the seller to swallow financing part of that inventory rather than the actual price they're charging for the business?
Ask that again. Ask that question one more time.
Yeah, for example, if you're buying a retail store where the asking price is, let's say, $150,000, but there's, on top of that, you have to buy, let's say, another $100,000 or to $150,000 of inventory, so that your total disbursement is close to $300,000. Would it be easier for the seller to finance the inventory, for example, than to actually finance the purchase price, given that in the inventory, at least there's some sort of secured asset behind that payable that you would have against towards the seller?
Potentially. When you get into, well, actually, first of all, I'm going to go back to non-competes real quick.
Yep.
A non-compete as part of the sale of a business is absolutely 100% enforceable, right? Because the contract specifies how much money is being given for that non-compete. And as long as you don't get crazy about distance and stuff like that, it's absolutely enforceable. So every sale of a company or purchase of the company, if you're buying it, should have a non-compete that's reasonable with the owner that's getting out of it. Back to the seller financing. That's hard to, it depends. So when you get to seller financing, it depends on what their motivation is, right? And some people won't touch it with a 10-foot pole. Some people like it because it spreads out your capital gains as the seller, right? Because you get money over time. And depending on what they're planning on going out and doing, having that money over time might be better. If they're retiring, maybe they'll be in a lower tax bracket. If they're going to go start other businesses, particularly if they're passive type real estate businesses, not taking that huge hit up front in that first year can help them because they might have losses in their next business that money can offset.
Okay.
I will tell you, if you're a seller and you're considering owner financing, definitely work with your CPA and your attorney. And I have done it, even though my on one of my non-negotiable list was I wouldn't carry, carry a note. I ended up doing it, but it was only a smaller portion of the overall. It wasn't the whole deal. But I would not do it without a personal guarantee.
Okay.
So business guarantees are always part of it, but they had to be willing to sign a personal guarantee and put the rest of their assets up if they wanted me to be their bank.
Do you think on the terms of the loan would, something like prime rate would be reasonable, or would a premium have to be charged on top of that prime rate for the seller to have that as an asset that earns a decent interest rate?
You're kind of getting beyond what I have a lot of experience with. I have a CPA that I've worked with for almost 20 years, and she's the one that helps me with all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing I'll say about that question is it depends on the seller's motivation. When you get to owner financing, if you want to explore that, you have to get really good about creating a relationship with the seller and understanding what they want out of the deal. Because if you're good at that, you can structure some very creative deals that get you to buy the business at maybe a little bit lower upfront cost, but is a better deal for the seller because of tax reasons or whatever else.
Understood. Thank you very much.
Okay. Aaron, any more questions in chat?
Yep, we have a question from Veronica, if you want to unmute and ask.
Hi, Bob. My question is, I am looking at purchasing a business that's already established, and I'm just curious the pros and cons of keeping the current EIN number and just a DBA for a rebranding of the name of the business. If there's pros and cons or things that I would maybe need to know about behind the scenes, that's not a good idea.
So essentially, there's two ways to buy a business. One is you buy the entity, which would mean you would keep the current EIN number, right? Because that's specific to the entity, the LLC, the S Corp or whatever. And then the second way to buy it is you buy the assets. And in almost all deals, as a buyer, you just want to buy the assets. Because if you buy the entity, you've bought all the liability that goes back how many ever years. Because if I'm going to come in and sue XYZ, I'm suing that entity, and whoever owns the entity is responsible for that liability. The one exception to having to buy assets that I know of that's a good reason, and there's probably others that your CPA can help you with. But if you're buying a business that has contracts and the contract specifies it's not assignable to someone else, then all you can do is buy the asset or buy the entity if you want to keep those contracts. But that's a pretty rare situation. The other thing about doing an asset purchase is it allows you to start the depreciation all over. Like I said, my CPA could explain all that to you better than I can, but those are the two big highlights. So work with your lawyer and your CPA, but in most cases, you just want to buy the assets, which would be inventory, goodwill. And if it's a service business, most of what you're paying for is goodwill, right?
I mean, I feel like I'm buying the customers
Mhm.
that are already utilizing the business. And I think for me, one of the concerns was, as a new business owner, having to potentially go for credit applications with all of the different distributors and vendors that the business is using, in addition to running the business, because that's what my job will be. So can you speak a little bit more to what liabilities I would also be purchasing, other than there's no debt currently on the business with the owner who has it? And I heard what you said about people coming back to sue me. Would there be any other liabilities that would be worth considering in that scenario?
That one I'm just going to defer on. I think that's a legal question. Those are the primary ones that I worried about. But I'm sure there's others. I just don't have good examples of them. Did everybody kind of get the difference between an asset purchase and a entity purchase? And Veronica, so if you are buying the business, the entity, to try to make sure you don't have to renegotiate contracts with vendors and all of that, take a look at those vendor contracts, because some of them state a significant change in ownership in the entity will trigger the same thing. So it's really about those vendor contracts, if that's your main reason for, one of the main reasons that you want to buy the entity. Any other questions, Aaron?
Nope, we're good for now. So we'll open it up for questions again and before we conclude the call. These are great questions.
Very good questions. Yep. Okay. So now we're getting down to the end of the process, or more towards the end of the process, which is preparing your staff for the change. Early, long before there's a purchase agreement, talk about in your team about the fact that, yeah, you're going to die, you're going to retire, something might change, and eventually you'll be departing from the business, right? And you don't have to say, hey, I'm getting ready to sell. It's just like, I want you guys to consider this, particularly if you have that higher, if you're paying your employees part-time, or most of them are part-time and they're at that lower skill set, it's not as important. But in the service industry, you're going to have typically people that you depend on. So start having those discussions. As you build your business to sell, make some test runs, take more time off. And when I mean take more time off, make sure that you aren't answering every phone call and email that comes in. So 3 or 4 years before we sold, my wife and I started doing trips out of the country, right? No email, no voicemail. And so for 1 or 2 weeks, our staff had to deal with everything that came in. And then when we got back, we would recoup, we would get back with them and talk about what went well and what didn't. So that time away without contact helps you understand where you're at with your business as far as building value and building leaders. You don't even have to necessarily be gone, but just stop solving all your issues in your business, right? As owners, so here's where I come from, right? For many, many years, I believed I was always the smartest person in the room. And I had a big ego from that, right? And so I always wanted to hear from the most knowledgeable person in the room, which was me, right? So anytime anything came up, I would just give people the answer because I was sure my answer was right. Well, guess what? I'm not the smartest guy in the room. Even if I'm the only guy in the room, it's 50-50 whether I'm the smartest one in the room. Okay, so start allowing your people to make decisions, and it's slow. And if you're a business owner, an entrepreneur like me, right, everything has to be fast, fast, fast. But if you'll take that time, and when someone asks you a question, if you'll just reflect it back and say, well, that's a good question, what do you think? Or some way push it back and just help them solve it. What I found out was most of the people that work for me had better ideas than I did once I'd shut up and let them voice their opinion, as opposed to just always having my own opinion. So stop solving all the problems in your business. That'll help you understand. And then anybody feel like I'm beating this leadership thing to death? It's important. Now, Bill is got a little bit different situation, right? He hires temporary employees in the summer. So building leaders isn't probably as big of an issue. But you still may want to have that one guide that's been around for quite a few years, so that when I come in and buy the rafting part of the business, I know there's someone there to show me the ropes. Because here's the other thing. No matter what a seller tells you, it's a good possibility that they'll check out shortly after closing. Because a lot of times people are selling because they're at their wit's end. And even if it's in the contract that they're supposed to be available 30, 60, 90 days, it's pretty hard to enforce if they just check out and quit returning calls. So as a buyer, even in a small mom and pop business, if there's that one person in there that can help me in case the seller checks out, it's a good thing. Adds more value. The other thing that I want to make sure that we cover, which is, here's what a lot of business owners do when they sell their business. They stop focusing on the business and they focus on selling their business. And someone pointed out earlier, from the time you list your business and find someone that's interested until the time you close is 3, 6, or 9 months, depending on how big your business is and all the due diligence and everything. And so if you take the eye off the ball and only focus on the sale, most statistics show that 50% or more deals never close. And so if you don't continue to run your business while you're trying to sell your business, you can lose a tremendous amount of value. Because if the sale falls through, then you got to go back into running your business and try to build the value back up and whatever got neglected, particularly if you haven't built those leadership and made sure that the business runs without you. One of the guys that had an IT business out in Philadelphia, I watched him do that. And his deal took 9 months, and 3 days before closing, the buyer pulled. And he had quit doing contract renewals, and it happened to fall right when a lot of his 3-year contracts were up. His employees had just kind of went off the rails in some areas. And so when the deal fell through, he had to pull the business off the market, and he spent 6 or 8 months getting things back to where they were so he could try to sell it again. So I tell business owners that are selling, you're going to work harder during the sales process than you probably have since you started the business, because you need to be working 40, 60, 80 hours a week that you currently do, plus that extra time to do the sale of the business. If not, you're putting yourself at risk. So here it is, continue working on and in your business, okay? Before you even get to the point of actually listing it and or accepting a purchase agreement, collect the due diligence documents. Your CPA is going to know 95% of what that buyer is going to want, and just have all that stuff collected and ready to send out after you get under contract. Sometimes collecting these due diligence documents and weeding the information out can be very time consuming. And the quicker you can get that stuff to a potential buyer as a seller, the better the deal gets started. And the same way if you're buying, right? If I'm buying a business and I ask for 3 years worth of taxes and 3 years worth of P&Ls and all the customer contracts, and it takes them 2 weeks to come back with that basic information, I start wondering how they've been running this business. All right, so collect your due diligence, decide if you're going to use a broker and to what extent, determine how you're going to use your lawyer and to what extent. So I have a great lawyer here in Glenwood. Her name's Susie Richardson. I have the utmost respect for her. She does an amazing job, but she never is involved with the negotiation of a buy or sell. I handle that with the other side personally. Now, she's involved in every step. She knows all that I'm asking, but I've never found it effective to have lawyers negotiate a business sale or purchase. It's expensive and it slows things down. Now, if you're selling to the corporation and you're going to go to that book I showed in the beginning, you better have your lawyer involved, and they better be doing negotiations, because you're dealing with a bunch of lawyers on the other side, and there's no better way to get screwed by you trying to fill the role of a lawyer. And in fact, even a local lawyer is going to be challenged to deal with those larger companies. But figure out how you're going to use your lawyer. Determine ahead of time what you're going to do with the money, right? Because you have a lot more options in taxes and structuring things before closing. After closing, you're just stuck. And you're going to pay the IRS 40 to 45% of your sale price in taxes if you aren't doing some clever stuff ahead of time. And that's a lot of money to lose when, if you engage a few professionals, you have a chance at least keeping part of that 40 to 45%. And then really determine what you're going to do after your sale. So I worked with Arland. He was the mentor that had started the peer group. And I spent 2 one-hour phone calls with him to go through what I would do in my next phase of life, because I did sell my business and I retired for 6 weeks. And the retirement was wonderful, but at the end of 6 weeks, I had out all the retirement I could take. I'm from the Midwest, and we're real thrifty back there. And so to save money, we combine our retirement party and our funeral in the same event, and it makes it easy, right? So we sat down, and after 2 hours of talking about, I could go be an employee for someone else, I could work in the current business, or I could start another business. And it was painfully obvious that the first 2 were not even an option for me. I make a terrible employee, and I know I could run the business I just sold better than the guy that bought it from me. So it really helped me understand what I was going to do next in order to know what the structure of the deal was going to be. So spend some time on that. Meet your buyer or seller several times before you get to the offer phase, I think, so that you can figure out, the second thing on operational maturity that really predicts success in a purchase or a sale is core values. And if you think like I thought core values were for many, many years, it was stupid. And then when my wife, Janet, decided that we were going to do it, then it was an exercise that I would keep my mouth shut for about an hour, hour and a half in the conference room once a year. She'd post the core values up on the wall, and then we'd ignore them until a year later when we reevaluated them, right? That's how much value I put in core values. Well, I was so wrong, it's just unbelievable, because if a business that's buying and selling, if their core values don't somewhat align, number one, your chances of closing the deal goes way down. And then number two, dissatisfaction from the owner, the buyer, the seller, the employees, and the customers go up significantly. So OML and core values will really give you a pretty good gauge of how successful a transaction can be. And the only way you can figure out people's core values in their business is spend some time with them and around the business. We talked about OML, we talked about lawyers' involvement, and then really dig in. If you're buying a business, and you have to ask this question many times in several different ways, but understand why someone wants to sell. And if you're selling your business, the buyer should be doing the same thing. Understanding what's motivating the transaction will really help it be more successful. Post-sale. So we got to the closing table, we got our check, we're prepared to give the government almost half of what we've worked for the last 26 years, which don't get me started on that one. And then what's going to happen after the sale? So I know several business owners that the guy that sold to them wouldn't answer his cell phone 1 hour after closing, and they were just stuck figuring everything out. So have some plans on how you're going to transition, and have some backup plans if that happens. Understand that the sale of your business is really traumatic for your employees and your customers. And I had no idea. I spent so much time investing in my employees and we talked about eventually I was going to sell and do something else. I just didn't understand how traumatic it was going to be until the guy that had been with me the longest, 17 and a half years, he came up to me after the fact and he said, "Do you know what just happened?" He said, "You just arranged my marriage and I didn't get to meet the bride until the altar." Right? So that's how traumatic he felt it was, because once you go under contract, you're going to be under a non-disclosure, and you're only going to be able to, in typical transactions, to talk to your banker, your lawyer, your CPA, or any other professionals that you know deem possible. You can't start talking to the employees about what's going on, and you shouldn't, because 50% of the deals fall through, and it's a traumatic experience, and you create all these issues, and then the deal doesn't go. So just understand that it's traumatic for both customers and employees. Once the sale happens, if transition is important to you, or as a seller, or if it's important to the buyer and he's written it in the contract, you want to go communicate with all the customers, the big ones, one-on-one, right? And introduce who the new person is. If you're the buyer, understand that it'll take 5 to 7 times of communication in different ways to your customers to really start locking in that relationship. So a welcome letter saying, "Hey, Joe sold and I bought," that's 1 of 7. Showing up and meeting them in person, that's 1 of 7. So when you buy that business, have a strategy for communication, because it's terribly important. And then know you're going to have regrets, right? Buyer and seller remorse. I don't care how good the deal is, it's going to be, there's going to be some there. And know that as you either buy or sell your business, because it'll be a lot less traumatic. Yeah, I think my last sale, actually my last purchase was the biggest one, that in magnitude, right? We had some major issues happen 1 week after the sale. Those issues were completely outside the seller's control. There was, you know, it wasn't like we found something in the books. It's just some external thing happened. And it was tough for several weeks to get through that. So it's going to happen. Just be prepared for it. So we've got about 15 minutes, and I like to put this slide up to make sure we kind of covered all the elements. So we talked about the elements of the business sale, you know, what you might be selling, how you might structure, that kind of thing. We talked in very general terms about figuring out business evaluations. The 3 most common that I know of is cap rate, EBITDA, like a multiple of EBITDA, or a multiple of revenue. Recasting financials. We didn't talk much about that. So Bill, as a mom and pop organization, there is a lot of things that you can put through your business for tax purposes that can affect the sale of your business. It's not what you're doing is illegal. They are valid, you know, expenses. Like you go to Hawaii every year for 2 weeks for a conference, you know, the industry conference. The problem with having a lot of that in the last 2 or 3 years is if the person buying your business is going to get a loan to do it, which almost all buyers will have to do. A lot of times the banks will say, "I don't care about anything except for what shows up on the tax return." And that's all they'll loan off of. So if you have a lot of this stuff in there that has to be recasted, which means pulled out, it can really affect who your buyers are, because the banks may not lend off of what your P&L shows versus what your taxes show. So as you're getting closer, make sure you're pulling a lot of that stuff out. It just makes for a cleaner sale. Business financing, right? There's really only 3 ways to get the deal done: an SBA loan, a conventional loan, an owner carry, assuming the buyer doesn't have the cash in his pocket. Okay. So understand that those are the 3 basic ways. An SBA loan is going to be, it's going to allow you to come in with less money down. Interest rates are higher, and there's a ton of documentation and rules you have to follow. SBA loans are great. They just have their place. conventional loans, their bankers are going to want you to come with at least 30% of the purchase price and sometimes more. So that means significant cash, which on an SBA side loan, there isn't as much to invest. And then owner carry. Those deals, like I said, are just really about what works for the seller and what their end goals are. And they can be a component of a lot of different things. Okay? If someone's just been trying to sell their business for 2 years, they're absolutely done. And they're basically either going to get it sold in the next 6 months or walk away from a lot of value, then you can get some pretty creative owner carry situations, because it's not that you're taking advantage of them, but there's more options in those kinds of sales. Value drivers, we talked about it, leadership, your books, reoccurring revenue, those types of things. Asset versus stock, we talked about that a little bit with Veronica, is to really understand which one you need to go for, and knowing that the asset purchases are better in a lot of those deals, but your CPA and lawyer can help you with that. Purchase price allocation. I just bring this up because I still kind of struggle with understanding the tax ramifications. I'm your typical entrepreneur that, for the first 15 years I owned the company, if there was money in the bank, we were doing good, right? I don't think I even really paid attention to P&L. So in the later years, I understood P&L and balance sheet, but purchase price allocation. So what's good for the seller is not so good for taxes on the buyer, and vice versa. And most purchase agreements will have that laid out or have a time period to get that laid out. So definitely work with your CPA to understand what that does for your tax position. And then we talked about when and why you might buy and sell. Okay. We've covered all those, so we won't go back into them. Okay, so that's my contact information. Anyone's welcome to send me an email or give me a call. I love talking about buying and selling businesses. In the last few years of owning my IT company, either working on a laptop or a desktop to make it do what I wanted it to do, or working on a buy or sell is what I did at night when I came home for relaxation. So I love to talk about this stuff. Take me up on it if you have questions, and I'd be happy to have a conversation or multiple conversations with you. In fact, it's what I primarily do with the SBA for the most part. Okay, questions that we haven't answered? Anything in chat, or anybody want to unmute?
Yeah, I recently was talking to the National Christian Foundation, and was considering donating my business to them. They said they could give me a huge tax break in that way, where they would be they could be 100% shareholder or even less. Have you ever heard of doing that? Where I'd be still be managing my company, but no longer owning it. I'm not quite sure how that all works out if I were to go ahead and sell it then, but yeah, just kind of starting some talks with them. And,
I have no experience, and I've never heard of anybody doing that. So no, I'm not sure how that would work.
okay.
Sorry. Other questions?
If anyone else would like to, feel free to unmute and you can ask questions live.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
Sometimes I've heard from, I'm also a SBDC counselor. I've heard from clients that a bank, if they're involved in helping the transaction via lending, of course, sometimes that they might require that the seller keep, and this might be my own words, keep some skin in the game by owner financing as part of the transaction. Is that common, uncommon? Have you heard of that?
I don't know how common that is. The banks are certainly interested in having the buyer have skin in the game, for sure.
Yeah.
But I've never been involved in a deal where that would happen or that's happened. As a seller of a business, I wouldn't be too excited about that because the bank isn't going to take second position. So the bank's going to take first position. And if they want the seller involved, they're going to force them to second position, because those hybrids, if you're carrying everything, you're in first. So if there's any problems, you get paid first. But in the case of what you're talking about, I'd be leery as a seller because now I'm in second position. And if something goes wrong, there's a good chance I'm not going to get my money.
Okay. Thank you.
Mhm. Anything else before we kind of close it down? The hard part about Zoom is if I'm in a room, I can look around and see people's facial expressions and know if someone's about ready to ask a question. And then if I continue the silence, I give them the opportunity to do it, but that's almost impossible on Zoom. So jump in there if you have a question. If not, we'll let you get off to whatever else you have in your day.
Hey, Bob, can you hear
Yes.
me? I just had a really simple question. And by the way, thank you for all your great information. The question has to do with bootstrapping in the context of, growing a business and perhaps being in a position to sell it. What's going to look better to a buyer? And I know this is sort of a trick question, but would it be better for a buyer to see a recent debt financing round, or better to see just cash flow and good old fashioned bootstrapping in the transaction? And is the answer to that, it depends on the buyer?
No, I can
Thanks.
answer in generalities. Hey, Aaron, would you pop up that last poll before too many people jump off? And then I'll answer your question, Dan. So the last poll comes from my EOS consulting, which is whenever I do a presentation or a meeting, I like to get some ranking back. So if you'll select how effective this was for you today, this is anonymous, just on a scale of 1 to 10, I'd appreciate it. So Dan, in most cases, it's cash flow, right? And as a buyer, I'm looking for consistent growth in the cash flow. So if over the last 4 years, it's been somewhat stagnant, and then all of a sudden the last year, there's a huge jump, I'm not going to be nearly as excited as if I saw just a consistent growth. That being said, if there's some really good reasons why you've refinanced or put a bunch of debt into the company, if you had a bunch of steady growth and then you decided to expand customers and do all of that kind of stuff, then maybe. But in general, as a buyer, I'm going to be looking for that consistent growth, or I want a fairly steep discount because I'm coming in and buying your business because I think I can make it better. And buyers do not pay for the potential in your business. Not smart buyers anyway, right? So they see potential and they want to grow it or do whatever, but they don't pay you because there's potential in most cases.
Thanks. That's good advice. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Okay, so Bob, we have a question that was texted to me due to tech issues.
Okay.
What is the most common way to value a retail brand? Multiple of EBITDA. I'm sorry, I don't know what that means, Jeff.
EBITDA.
Multiple of net income or cash flow.
I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. I've never done much in that retail space, so I'd have to point him back to a CPA resource because I don't know.
Jeff, you can sign up for consulting and we can connect you. We can dig into that a little bit more in depth, or shoot me an email. I'm learning with everyone. So let's see. Bob, will you say the name again of the book that you recommended?
Yeah. Instead of saying it, I'll just go back to it. And So some of my friends, two guys I know, sold dentists' offices, and they were multi-location, multi-chair dentist offices, and they sold them to the big guys. And one of them actually recommended this book because he said this barely survived in transition. He said the last few weeks, he wondered if he was going to have to pay them to close the deal. He said it's just so hard to deal with those corporation type large companies. So this is the book that he recommended for anybody that's in that kind of a transaction.
Perfect. Another question in the chat. Do you have any statistics about what percentage of sales are buyer financed SBA or cash transactions?
I don't, but Aaron, I'll bet you can find that for him.
As I said it out loud, I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah.
Cool. We're looking good in the chat.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for your participation. Lots of good questions, and I appreciate you helping me out with my ego and asking the questions.
Yeah, so just a reminder, you can register for consulting. If it's something that Bob can't help with, then we have finance experts who can help with your cash flow projections. They can help with your financial statements, your financing processes. But Bob does consult with us, very generous with his time, and so we can connect you with him as well. And he's great to bounce ideas with. So please just visit our website, coloradosbdc.org, to find your local SBDC, and we'll get you matched with a consultant or with several different consultants who can help with the specific questions you have. It's a great resource to tap into, especially if you're hearing this information and realizing, wow, I really need a couple more years to build up the valuation of my business. This is a great time to be working on that.
Yep.
Bob, thank you so much. This was tremendous information. I see thumbs up in
Thank you.
the videos. Really great feedback. So this was recorded. I'll send it back out for those who are wondering, wanting to play back the beginning of the tape. And we plan to continue to offer this as a topic. We recognize that right now with the current economic situation, it has people more than ever thinking about selling, but also buying. More and more people who are trying to move to rural Colorado or looking for ways to work for themselves. So this is a topic that we're going to host on a regular basis, and your feedback is appreciated so that we can continue to grow and improve any of the dialogue that we have. But I particularly appreciate the questions that you shared today. I think we learned a lot through that. And Bob, thank you again.
Okay, and when we get offline, I'd like to see the that last poll results.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll share that with you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
We'll talk to you soon.
Have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye-bye.